That's a really great question. One of the things I see with many leaders is that they're frightened or they don't want to admit they always don't have the answers. They feel that if they don't have the answers that is asked of them by their team, excuse me, or their organization, that's failure. But then I put it back to them to say, how can you know everything that's going on? Particularly, and one great example of this, if you look back at the past 4 years, the amount of disruption that individuals have had, but also organizations have had with the pandemic. We've got economic issues. There's so much changing. Plus, on top of that, technological advances. I mean, a lot of people are talking about AI as an example, what impact that has. But with all this that's changing, with all that's happening around us, how can we know everything? And what is to stop us saying, look, team, for example, I need your help. I don't know. And that's the one I hear coming up a lot. And it is stopping leaders from actually leading and trying to move forward. They've got a real, a kind of deep down issue with this. That's what I typically see. The other thing that kind of then leads on to is imposter syndrome. Okay. Because again, linking back to what I said earlier, if they feel they don't have all the answers or they're frightened of failure, then they think, oh, but how will people think of me? Will they think I'm a fraud? Will they think, why is he in that lead, or he or she's in that leadership position? Because what are they doing for us? They're not actually, they don't seem to know very much about what they're doing. But another thing that then leads on to, and again, I hear this from many of my clients, is that they struggle to delegate because typically they want to keep everything to themselves because they want to show they know something, they can do it, but then they don't delegate to the rest of the team. That then starts to, cause issues within the team because they feel, what is our purpose? What are we actually doing here? What's the point? Because the other thing that I think that insecurities of some leaders now is also coming from the fact that we are seeing generational differences in our team. And if we look at Gen Z as an example, Gen Z typically have a very different mindset. They want to be growing. They want to be learning. They want to be moving forward. But if they feel they're not getting that from their leader, some of them start to feel abandoned. So we have that, again, another problem that's coming through with delegation. The other interesting thing that's also coming up, an insecurity with leaders, but I'm seeing this as leaders get much older, time management and having enough time to do what they want becomes more of a problem because then personal life has a bigger impact. So when you start to have a family, for example, you don't get the same freedoms you had beforehand because you've got to look after kids, for example, or whatever it might be. And there is a real juggling act that these leaders have to say, well, yeah, but I want to keep working on this, but I have to be home at 6 o'clock or I have to pick up the kids or whatever it might be. So again, that's another insecurity they don't typically talk about, but is preying on their mind and is adding to the stress. Because if you think about what I've discussed so far, this is where we get stress coming through and anxiety. And when that stress and anxiety is there, that adds to even more insecurities because you're starting to feel you're not in control of yourself and in your role as a leader. But there's a couple of other interesting ones I see, and I would suggest 90% of my leadership clients, this topic always comes up as an area to develop, and that is learning assertiveness skills and pairing that up with effective communication. Because the other problem we have is that a lot of leaders, they don't communicate how they want to because they feel certain circumstances are potentially conflict, or they feel, but I've got to get my point across here, and I don't agree with what's being said. but they're lacking self-confidence to be assertive and to believe in what they are saying, so they don't actually say anything. They let everyone else talk, kind of talk around them. So assertiveness is a big problem I see as well. But then a lot of that also leads to they don't want to deal with conflict. I've got a number of leadership clients. They bring up the fact there's conflict in my team, there's conflict in the organization. I don't like conflict. I don't know how I'm going to deal with this. And then we've got to work on, well, how do we develop those skills to take that forward? Because then the other insecurity that then leads on to is office politics. And again, we have a number of leaders, they don't know how to deal with office politics. And in some companies, office politics is just, it's happening all around them, and they don't know how to navigate past that.
Mm. I heard one leader a couple of years ago say to me, Daniel, I'm afraid to ask for help. And I said, why are you afraid to ask for help? They said, because if I ask for help, I've got to peel back the curtain. And when I peel it back, they're going to see all the cracks. And maybe they realize I'm not as good as I thought or they thought I was going to be.
Yeah.
And I've seen that being their first problem. And I think this also comes from the British and the Australian society, where asking for help has become a dirty word. Oh, you need help? What's wrong with you? Something wrong? No, something's right. Because what I believe is that strong people ask for help, but it's cultural. It's that environment. And if that's not top down in the organisation, then where's that leader going to get that support? And leaders are crying out for help.
Yeah. But doesn't that also, because there's a big shift now, that we're seeing that actually people like people who are authentic. And actually, should we be coming across as pretending we know it all? Because in fact, is that not putting a barrier in front of us? And it's what you said there. It's like, oh, stripping, my front cover and people see inside me. But I question, is that not a good thing for leadership? Because we are human, we are authentic, we are, we're like everyone else. That's how I frame leadership, but we're just doing a different role, typically. So why not show that we are vulnerable, but actually that shows an authentic side that we can, the kind of human authentic side of that.
When I was with Emirates Airline, I was in a leadership role. And as a senior flight steward, I had a team of 17,500 cabin crew, and every flight I had 17 new crew. And the way that the business was structured, that we had to complement the flight. And what that meant was we had to have an Arabic speaker, we had to have an English speaker, and we had to have local language speakers. And it was quite fascinating. If we were doing a flight to Japan, the crew complement would change. Because it would be 90% Japanese, it meant we needed a lot more crew. And the Japanese customers, they didn't want to speak in English because it wasn't their native tongue, and they found it very hard to get their idea across to the crew. So the company would put a lot more Japanese crew on the flight. And it was fascinating because the customer would actually raise their complaint to the crew, and we could resolve it on the aircraft. But if we didn't have enough Japanese speakers, they wouldn't tell the English speakers, and we could potentially lose a customer. And as a leader on these international flights, if there was an in-flight emergency and I knew the capabilities and strengths of my crew, then I could delegate them a role. And at 40,000 feet, you've got to know your team, but you don't have to know it all. We were trained as first responders, but we had people on our team who were doctors, they were paramedics, they were dentists, they had all these phenomenal skills. And if we knew that strength and said, hey, you know more than me right now, get in there and fix it, they would jump in. And we had that wonderful culture. But for a smaller business who hasn't been around that culture, they really need some good advice and support to generate and build a new culture where you can have situational leaders. Hey, you're the best. You go and talk to the customer. My wife speaks Chinese. You go and speak to all the Chinese speakers. You'll save my life. Makes life so much easier. These insecurities, we don't necessarily want to talk out loud about them. We know they're there and we just hope that somebody knows enough to come and help us. Once we start to work through them, what is the end result that the leader is looking for? What is it that they want more of than anything else?
Now, that's an interesting question, because there are some leaders I've met who don't know what they want. They have been put into a leadership position, but they've not had that development of leadership skills. So they feel, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. So there is that element that exists, and that's an area that we really need to work on. But there are other leaders who are hungry. They want to make impact. They want to have influence. They want to make that department, that organization a success. And they'll say, right, what do I need to do to get that, to make sure that executes? But there are other leaders as well. What they also want, and what it links back to this for impact and influence, is thinking, what is that vision? What is that strategy? And where do I need to take not just me, but my team and my organization, not just in the next year, but in years 2 and years 3? And good leaders will look at the bigger picture, not just, if you think about, I want to set a strategy for my department, but it's also thinking, right, well, I need to build relationships with people out with my department, because the strategy I want to develop, how does that impact other departments within the organization, as an example? Or if you're more client focused, how does that impact external stakeholders? What is working for them? So they have a hunger to think, right, I need to know all these, I need to build all these relationships. I need to understand everything that's going on. But then there's another thing, and it links back to your story there, about team development. Good leaders want to make sure that they understand their team, they know the strengths in their team, they empower their team, and they take them on that journey. Because my mantra as a leader was always, I am nothing without my team. And my first priority was to always go in and get the team organized, make sure they knew what they were doing, get to know them, understand the strengths, think about, if I haven't got the strengths in my department, what does that mean for my strategy? Can I bring in the necessary strengths? Or, do I need to look at developing certain members of my team? That was key for me, because if I've got a happy team and a motivated team, my job as a leader is much, much easier. But I do see, unfortunately, in some organizations, and there was a skills matrix I was looking at the other day, the leaders were good at product development. They were good at, profit, everything, all the other things within the organization. But what they weren't good at was anything to do with the team. There were red warning signs that the team don't even know you. The team don't even understand what they're here for. The team don't have a common purpose. And they felt lost. But what was happening there, the leader was doing a lot of that work themselves. And I actually said to the leader, if your team was doing that work for you, how much further would your department be as a result? And I got the look of, well, that's an interesting question. Okay, so that was another area. But I think, going back to the original question, what do they want? Some leaders want, if anything else. I think the other key thing here, and those that are hungry, that want to succeed, they know they've got to bring in adaptability and resilience. They've got to be able to manage risk. They've got to think change management, a big area. And they're keen to think, right, I know that what I'm working on now, or that strategy I'm deploying for the next year, might well change. But how do I adapt to that? Maybe I've got to bring in plan B, plan C. but I know what I'm doing can change very quickly. And typically, the change is not within my control.
Mm.
But I take it in my stride. I see some leaders, the thought of change frightens them because they think, well, but I'm working on this. This is my set goal. But in business, do we have set goals or do we have aspirational goals?
I love that word change. And I've heard that so much. I asked a business owner recently, as an end of result of doing this, what do you want? He said, I just want to change. And I said, what do you want to change for? He said, for the better. And I said, well, what's a better change? He said, I want to be more influential. I said, and what else? He says, I want to have a bigger impact. And he said, I want a business that just attracts top talent. And he said, if I can make that change within me, then I can start to attract better people into the business. And I said, then if you do that, then what? He goes, as a result, the income's going to go up. He goes, the income is just going to be a reward for being more influential and having a bigger impact. And it's fascinating to hear these words, the words that you're sharing here: change, impact, influence. I'm hearing this consistently from a lot of leaders. So it's there and it's available to them. They've just got to find that way. And the way to get there is by going in a new direction.
Mm-hmm.
It's making some better decisions and going on a new journey. So as these business people make these changes, as they start to get this greater level of influence, as they have more impact, what does the journey look like and how does that change the leader?
Well, I'd like to step back because that's a really interesting point. It's like, well, how does that leader become more attractive to their organization? And for me, the first part here is self-awareness. There are many leaders that are stuck in a kind of rat race. They're so busy in the department, they're doing all the day-to-day stuff. But when do they ever sit back and think, who am I? Do I know myself enough? Because the analogy, and we're starting to see more of this now, is that if you can't understand yourself and you cannot lead yourself, how can you lead others? And I think that's it's a really important part because, as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the keys for leaders is to be people orientated and to care. But if you're not caring about yourself and you're not thinking about yourself, it makes it much harder to think about and care for others. So we ask that question, can you lead yourself? But then we think, right, what is your resilience? What is it? Where's your confidence levels? Now, there's an interesting part here that, and this is what I do with a lot of my leaders, we look at energy. And we look at this whole aspect of energy leadership and we ask, is your energy as a leader aligned? And what I mean by that, we see 6 influences of energy. And this is around your common purpose, doing what you want to do. Okay, that's a big energy area. Does it align with your values? Does it align with your career goals? Because as a starting point, if that isn't in alignment and you're not doing what you want to do, then that impacts your mental area. That's another energy influencer. So your focus isn't there. Your concentration's not there. And when that's not there, that can impact your emotional area of influence. Then it goes on to your social area, then physical area and environmental area. It's a big topic, but when we know that we are aligned, when our energy is where it needs to be, then we can start to become more attractive to companies. But this is a deep conversation, right? And this is where coaching does come in, because I think before we, going back to what we've discussed earlier, many leaders out there never get a chance to vent, never get a chance to speak to someone that's not involved in their organization, right? But just to say, this is my problems. I want to achieve this, but I don't know. I'm going to give you warts and all about me. And that's what coaching does, because it's very confidential. And then we unpick all that and we then think, right, what do we do with that? So when we look at that, we do that first of all, but we've also got to remember, and I think this is the other thing I'm seeing a lot of, and it's even conversations with global companies, we are seeing development of leaders typically at the top end of the business, but we're seeing very little with our middle managers, juniors, and those just coming into the workplace. So we have leaders out there who have been put into a role and they've not had that leadership, the development they need. So when we look at this, how do we become more attractive? So for those listening that maybe had little leadership experience, first thing is being able to, as I said, lead ourselves, but also think about building that team if you have one, right? That's the first thing. Because if we get the team right, and going back to what you said, the good examples of when you know the team, when they know what they're doing, you have the right resources, it makes life a lot easier. But the other thing that I think is key for many leaders is clear and effective communication. Because I'm coaching, clients who are working for leaders and they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. They don't know how they can approach their leader. They're not sure what that leader's actually all about. So they find it very hard because they're frightened to approach the leader. And we talked earlier about what are the fears of leaders, but actually what are the fears of staff that are reporting to those leaders, which is key. So that leads on to think about effective communication, but then the next thing to be attractive to that company is strategic vision. First thing I want to be doing when I come in as a leader is think, right, what is the strategy of this department and where are we going? Do I have the resources available to do what I want to do? So linking back to what we discussed about skills matrix. But maybe what this then starts to lead into is, what is that leader doing to continuously learn and develop themselves? Now, sometimes your organization will provide that, sometimes they won't. So what do you do proactively to keep learning and to keep helping yourself as a leader? Because the more we read, the more we understand how to lead, how to develop ourselves, the confidence grows. And as a result, we start to become better at problem solving. Because the more information we get, the more it helps us. Maybe we're using holographic thinking. This is like head, heart, and gut thinking, right? What's our gut telling us typically, and what we're supposed to do? So, we look at building that kind of problem solving, but then the other aspect there as well is, what can you actually deliver? Because what we see some leaders are doing, they're saying, well, no, I'm going to deliver all of this. But is that realistic? What can you actually deliver? So we've got much more result orientated goals, and we're getting much more tangible results, which is key as well. The other thing that's attractive to companies, and we touched on it, is being adaptable. Okay, because things always change, but it's how you cope with that. What is it you do with that? But here's the other thing, and we haven't touched on it yet, but it's key. High emotional intelligence. Because we've talked about many areas, particularly about team, making sure our team's working well, but it's ability to read and understand others. Not just your team, but your clients, external stakeholders, other stakeholders within the business. Because what this leads to as well, and what's key for a leader, is to network and relationship build. Because the more we get to know people, the more we build those relationships, the easier our job typically becomes. Why? Because we've now got these partners, people that will help us. And then it links back to what we started to talk about at the beginning. We build those relationships and people get to know us. Is it not easy to say, I need help? I don't know. What would you suggest I do?